I think most of you know me, but if you don't, I'm Rhoda Capron, and I am with the 300th Committee and the Historical Society. And as part of the town's 300th celebration in 2022, we're co-sponsoring the series of talks about what makes Nottingham a special place. Our first talk was about the geology of New Hampshire, especially the Pawtuckaway Mountains. And our next talk is going to be on Tuesday, April 20th at 7 p.m. And that talk is going to focus on the two generals from Nottingham, who were also the original members of the Society of the Cincinnati in the state of New Hampshire. And that's Joseph Silly and Henry Dearborn. And that talk is going to be given by the staff of the American Independence Museum in Exeter. But tonight, we are going to be talking about conserving loons in New Hampshire. And currently, Pawtuckaway is home to two pairs of nesting loons. And I know many people who live there, or if you're out on the lake, you enjoy seeing the loons, but they do face many threats. And our talk is going to be given by Carolyn Hughes, who's a biologist with the Loon Preservation Committee, and she's currently pursuing a master's degree in conservation biology from Antioch University, New England, where her thesis has focused on the impacts of increasing temperatures on loon nesting behavior. So, as I said before, if you have any questions, you can submit them through the chat, and Carolyn will answer them at the end of the program. And thank you for coming. And thank you, Carolyn.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight, Rhoda, and thanks to the 300th Committee as well. I usually like to start these presentations with a discussion of loon calls, because for a lot of people, that's really the most distinct and interesting thing about these birds, right? They have that haunting, beautiful call that if you've ever spent time on a New Hampshire lake, you just know it instantly. What folks might not know is that loons actually have 4 distinct types of calls that they give, and they're all, given in different circumstances, and they have different meanings. So I'm going to play the calls for you, and then we'll talk a little bit about what they mean. The first call I'm going to play is the whale. So hopefully you are all able to hear that. The whale is one of those quintessential loon calls that everyone knows. It's a call that loons use for long distance communication, usually between members of a pair. So if they're separated on the lake and they're trying to find each other, they'll wail back and forth until they hook up again. There are different variations of this call. Loons add more syllables to it, the more flustered and stressed they get. So if you hear a whale call that has a lot of syllables and it sounds a little bit frantic, probably that is in response to some sort of stressful situation, either an intruding loon coming into the territory, or maybe an eagle's flying overhead, something of that nature. The second call is the hoot, and this is one that, unless you've spent time in close proximity to loons, you might not have heard before. So it's a much softer call. It's one that is used for shorter range communication, usually between members of a family unit, so between members of the pair and their chicks. Loons can also give, again, a higher pitched, more frantic sounding version of this call. Usually when an intruding loon is coming in, they'll give this really high pitched hoot to alert their partner to the fact that, there might be trouble brewing. The yodel is a really interesting call because only the male loons do this. And so because male and female loons look identical, it's hard to tell them apart by sight alone. But if you hear one of them make this call, you know that that's the male of the pair. So sounds sort of like an angry seagull. And that is a call that a male loon will make when he's distressed or when he's feeling threatened. It's a territorial call, and it's used to show, whatever that threat may be, that loon is there and is ready to fight to defend his territory or his nest or his chicks. So we'll see loons making this call when an intruding loon comes into their territory. when an eagle's flying overhead. I've seen them do it actually when an airplane's flying overhead, probably because they mistake it for an eagle or some other type of avian predator. They'll also do this if people get too close to their nest or to their chicks. So, you know, it's not just those predators that can threaten them, it's also us humans. So if you ever are close to a loon and you hear this call, it's a good idea to back up and give them a little more space. And then the final call is the tremolo. So this is another one of those ones that you've probably heard. They do it in a couple of different contexts. So number one is in response to a perceived threat, sort of like when a male will yodel. Both loons will give a tremolo. I'll actually play it before I get further into the description. So yeah, so they'll play that, or they'll make that call when an intruding loon comes in. They'll make it again if an eagle or other predator is present. They'll make it if people are getting too close to them or their nest or their chicks. Tremolos are also given when loons are flying. And we think that might be because that loon is trying to alert other loons to its presence and elicit a response, right? So if a loon is flying over a lake and thinks, I'd like to stop there and maybe fish, it might give a tremolo to see if anything tremolos back. And if something tremolos back, that loon might think twice about stopping over on that lake. It might look for a safer spot to land. So I'm going to stop the share on this and I will pull up my PowerPoint. Okay, so can everyone see that? And is it full screen?
No, it's not full screen.
Oh, okay. Let me stop the share and restart it.
There you go. Yep.
Okay. Is it full screen now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So now that we've talked about what loons sound like, I'll launch into what they look like. Because sometimes at LPC, we do get calls from folks who, are reporting a loon sighting, and it turns out to be a lookalike species. So a merganser or a goose or a cormorant. Those are all species that are dark in color like a loon. And in the case of a merganser, they're black and white like a loon. So it makes sense that, that folks might get them mixed up. So I'll talk about some of those telltale signs that you can use to, make sure what you're looking at is a loon. The first is this black and white checkered pattern on its back. Other birds may be a more solid color, and so the loon is the only one that has that checkered pattern. The loon also has this black and white striped collar around its throat, and their neck and head feathers are actually iridescent. So in certain lights, especially this part of the neck right below that collar, it might look like its neck is green or blue or even purple. Sometimes folks get in touch with us and ask if we did some kind of color marking on that bird to track it. And the answer is no, it's just a natural part of their feathers. A third characteristic is that really distinct bright red eye. No other bird on our lakes has that. And then the fourth is this bill. So loons have a really, really sharp, we call it a dagger-like bill, and it's black. So mergansers and cormorants have yellow to red bills, and a goose has a bill that's a similar color, but it's a much different shape. So that, very sharp black bill is very distinct to the loon. So this is what a loon looks like in its breeding plumage. This is what they look like during the spring and the summer. But if you spent time on the lakes later in the season, in the fall, you'll know that this is not what loons look like year round. So, there we go. In the fall, they start to molt into their winter plumage. So you can see on this picture, this loon, its molt has started right around the bill. The feathers are turning white. Sometimes folks actually call us and ask if the loon has mange or if something's wrong with it when they see this. But this is just the natural part of, them molting out of their breeding season plumage and into their winter plumage. And you can see here that nice iridescent color on the neck, that sort of bluish green hue to it. And by the time they're on their wintering grounds, loons look completely different, right? So they have the same characteristic shape to them, but their plumage is a dull gray. Their eye is still red, but it's faded to more of a reddish brown. Even their bill has changed color to a gray to white, depending on the bird. So they look totally, totally different. And some folks do, call us and ask, they say there's this bird, it looks like a loon, but in terms of shape, but it doesn't look like any loon we've ever seen. And yeah, if you didn't realize that these birds were molting into this new set of plumage, you might think it was a totally different species. So loons spend their winters on the ocean. We have sort of limited data on where they go, but we do have some banded New Hampshire loons that we've been able to get resites of on the ocean. And so we know that our loons are sticking to the Atlantic coast. New Hampshire loons have been sighted as far north as Mount Desert Island and as far south as Cape May, New Jersey. So, relatively speaking, that's not a huge range. They seem to be sticking really, really close. And come about this time of year, they will start coming back to our lakes. Their migration, as best as we can tell, is triggered by changing photoperiod. So as the days start to get longer and there's more daylight, that's when loons start to realize that it's time to head back to their lakes. And because our loons don't winter far away from, their breeding state, we think that they actually make recon trips to come and check because it's not very far for them to fly. And those loons are showing up the day ice goes out or the day after. And so we really do think that they're coming to check on their lake. And if it's not iced out yet, they'll go back to the ocean and wait and then come back and check again so that they can get on territory as soon as possible in the in the spring. Once they get back to the lake, the members of the pair will spend a couple of weeks getting reacquainted with each other. As far as we can tell, they do not spend the winter together. So this is the first time they're seeing each other in a year. Loon courtship is very, very subtle. So they don't do a mating dance like some other species do. You might see them swimming around together, diving in sync, fishing together. The photo here shows what we call the bill dip. So again, it's very, very subtle. And if you didn't know this, you wouldn't know that it was a courtship behavior. They're very slightly dipping their bills downward, and that's a deferential type of behavior that you see among mated pairs, but not among, loons that aren't part of a pair. So they'll spend a few weeks getting reacquainted. You might see them, cruising along the shoreline, checking out some nest sites. And then they get to nesting. In New Hampshire, our median nesting date is the first week of June. So by the end of that first week of June, about 50% of our loon pairs are on the nest. We have some loons that start nesting as early May, and we have some that don't nest until early July, those later guys. But on average, they're starting to nest in early June. Typically, they will lay 2 eggs. Sometimes they lay just 1, and on very, very rare occasions, they'll lay 3 eggs. But most often it's 2 eggs. Most often they're laid between 12 and 24 hours apart. And then those loons start incubating the eggs. And they sit on them pretty much consistently for 26 to 28 days. The male and the female share incubation duties roughly equally. Earlier on in the nesting period, the male actually takes longer shifts, and that's because the female has just laid these 2 huge eggs. It takes a lot of energy, and so she needs a little more time to forage and sort of recoup that energy. So the male takes slightly more of the incubation duties in the earlier nesting period, but it evens out over time, and actually by the time it gets closer to hatch, the female is doing slightly more of the incubation. Because those eggs are laid 12 to 24 hours apart, they also hatch 12 to 24 hours apart. And that makes it so that there's a dominant structure among the 2 chicks. So that first chick that hatches has 12 to 24 hours worth of feeding on its sibling. So it's a little bit stronger. They do have sibling rivalry. So that older chick will let the younger chick know who's boss. He'll make sure that, it'll make sure it gets fed first. And you might see a little bit of bullying amongst those loon chicks. I should mention that loons will re-nest. So if their first nest attempt fails, either because they abandoned, because it got predated, something happened to cause it to fail, they can lay more eggs. In New Hampshire, I think the maximum number of re-nests we have documented in one season is 3. So that poor female loon had to spend a lot of energy making all those eggs. But if I'm remembering correctly, they did eventually hatch chicks, so it was worth it. Once these chicks hatch, they are pretty much ready to go. They might take a couple hours to dry out on the nest, but that first day of their life, they're in the water, they're swimming around. They will take short dives, but because they're so buoyant, it's pretty shallow. They tend to pop right back up like a little cork. And so at this point in their life, they're entirely dependent on the parents for feeding. The parents provide them 100% of their food. And you'll see them doing what they're doing in this photo, which is passing the chick a minnow. They might also catch leeches or other invertebrates to feed that chick. The chicks also spend a lot of time back riding at this stage of their lives when they're younger. And that's for a couple of reasons. Number one is because those small chicks are vulnerable to predation from below. So something like a snapping turtle or even a largemouth bass or other large fish on the lake will try to go after these chicks and they can predate them. And so staying safe on top of mom or dad's back is one purpose of back riding. The other is thermoregulation. So this chick is really small. It can get cold really easily. And so, they go up on the back, they go underneath the wings to stay warm. And, the parents help them maintain their body temperature. By the time the chicks are 5 to 6 weeks old, they start to look more like a loon, right? So we've got the bill that is elongating here, starting to look more like the parent's bill. You can't see it in this photo, but their legs and feet also get bigger. And the legs and feet are actually the part of the body that grows quickest and grows earliest. And that's because they need those to swim well and to dive. So at this point, this loon chick is able to dive better, and it can provide probably 30 to 50% of its own food, but it's still very, very heavily dependent on its parent. This chick is also starting to develop its first set of plumage. You can see on the face here and a little bit on the back, it's getting real feathers and that down is being replaced. We call this the punk rock stage because you'll see these chicks going around with little, fuzzy mohawks or just otherwise looking pretty scruffy. Oh, and I should mention that this chick in this photo is begging its parent. So if the chick is hungry and wants to be fed, they'll nudge the parent with their head. They'll even bite the parent's neck. They can be very, very pushy when they want food. And by the time these chicks are about 12 weeks old, they look like a loon and they're pretty much self-sufficient. They can provide 100% of their own food, although they will still beg their parents to try to get a free meal. At this point, they're probably practicing flight as well to prepare for their first migration. And you'll notice that their plumage looks a lot like that adult plumage when they're in, their winter plumage. The one difference is that with the immature loons, these juveniles, the ends of their feathers have a white tip, and so it creates this scallop-looking pattern. So I'm going to just scroll back really quickly to that picture of the adult so that you can see for comparison. There's no scalloping here. So if you're ever seeing, especially later in the fall, when the parents have changed to look like this and you're having a hard time telling them apart from their chicks, look for that scalloped pattern and that will let you know who's who. Okay, so, I guess one more thing I should mention is, how these loons leave in the fall. So typically the adults leave first. One parent will leave sometime between, mid-September and early November. The second parent will stay for another couple of weeks with the chicks, but then that parent leaves as well. And then these chicks are on their own to figure out migration for the first time. People always ask, how do they know where to go? And the answer is, I really don't know. It must be, some sort of instinct that they have. What we do see often is that groups of chicks will form on lakes. So it seems like all of the chicks in a given area sort of congregate on a larger lake and then fly out together. So that might be a strategy that they've used to, try to get everyone where they're going safely. Okay, so we all love watching loons on the lakes. Unfortunately, while they're here, they're very, very vulnerable. And there are a lot of things that can cause loon nests to fail. So I start off with this photo because I want to talk about some of the adaptations that loons have that make them really, really great in the water. They're excellent swimmers and divers, but also make them really bad on land. So if you look at the positioning of this loon's legs, they're very, very far back on the body, right? If this was a duck or a goose, the legs would be about mid-body. But on a loon, they're much further back. In addition to that, unlike most other birds, loons have really, really dense bones. So they're very heavy, which allows them to dive really well. They're like a little torpedo in the water. But those two features combined mean that loons are not able to walk well on land. They can't walk upright. If you've ever seen one getting on land trying to get to its nest, then you know that they sort of flop themselves down on their bellies and just push themselves along through the dirt with their feet. It's very awkward. It takes a lot of energy for them. And they're really vulnerable because they're moving so slowly, right? So if a predator came and tried to attack a loon while it was on land, that predator has a good chance of getting that loon because it can't escape quickly. And so for all of those reasons, loons nest close to the edge of the water. That's so, number one, they don't have to spend a lot of energy getting up to their nest. And also so that if some threat approaches, they can get off really quickly and get into the water where they're safe. And on, a natural lake that hasn't been dammed, this works out great, right? So this loon is right at the edge of the water. But, if there was a severe rain event, this loon could dip its bill down into the muck here, grab muck and build up its nest to keep pace with the rising water. On a lake that's dammed that might experience more dramatic water level fluctuations, a loon's nest can get flooded and it can also get stranded. So stranding happens when the water level decreases really rapidly. And there might just be a lot more land for that loon to cross to get to its nest, or it might just be at too steep of an incline where it's hard for the loon to get up. If the barrier becomes too much, the loons will abandon their nest. So water level fluctuations, both in terms of rapid increases and rapid decreases, are not great for loon nesting success. Human disturbance is another big problem. So if you look at the loon in this photo, it's doing what we call the hangover position. A loon that is not stressed out when it's on the nest will be sitting upright, it'll be looking around. This loon here that is hunched down low over the nest is trying to minimize its appearance. It's trying to hide. And it's also trying to make sure that, if it feels too threatened and it needs to get back into the water, all it has to do is kick its feet and it's there, right? Its head is totally angled down towards the water so it can make a quick escape. Unfortunately, loons do perceive us as threats, right? So if a boat gets too close to a nest, if a person swimming gets too close to a nest, sometimes we have nests that are on mainland shorelines that have trails going behind them. So if people are walking on the trail and get too close to the nest, all of those things can cause loons to flush. And if they flush off of the nest, those eggs are exposed and they're vulnerable to predation and they're vulnerable to overheating, especially if you're in a spot like this that is very exposed to sunlight. If an egg heats up too much, it can become inviable. So if you ever are on the water and you accidentally get too close to a loon nest and you see a loon doing this, please do back away, give it more space, back away until it, brings its head back up and looks alert. If you ever accidentally flash a loon from a nest, and it happens, I've accidentally done it before, the best thing to do is to leave the area immediately, because 9 times out of 10, if that threat leaves, the loon will get right back on its nest, continue incubating, and be fine. The problem really occurs when, the boat or whatever caused the loon to flush stays present. And the longer that loon is off the nest, the less likely it is that it's going to get back on the nest. There are some other threats to nesting loons as well. So shoreline development. The areas that loons like to build their nests also tend to be the places that we like to build our houses or our docks or, just other structures. And so on some lakes, the shoreline has become so developed that there's no good quality nesting habitat left for those loons. And so they're forced into more marginal habitat where they try and they try and they try to nest and they just fail and fail and fail over again because it's just not a good nest site for them. Human commensal mammals, so things like raccoons that have always been around, but now are around at higher population levels because they have human sources of food like garbage, are opportunistic predators of loon eggs. Avian predation. So it's really, really exciting that New Hampshire's eagle population has rebounded, right? Like it's a great feat for conservation. But eagles are predators of loon eggs. And this is a natural threat, and it's we prefer loons to be facing these natural threats, but in the presence of all these other human caused threats, it's sort of just one more thing on the pile. I should add that there are other avian predators of loon eggs. So we've documented on game cameras crows eating loon eggs, seagulls, ravens, and other birds. Contaminants. This is something that I won't get too deep into here because I'm actually not the one doing this research. I will put in a plug for a presentation that we are giving on our YouTube channel on April 15th, where our Swan Lakes biologist is going to do a deep dive on our contaminant research. But essentially, We go around and we collect all of the abandoned eggs, the eggs that don't hatch and are left behind by the loons. And we don't have funding to test them all, but we do test a subset, usually 4 to 6 eggs each year for a suite of contaminants, including PCBs, PFAS, dioxins, DDT, and a bunch of other contaminants as well. And in some of these eggs, we're finding those contaminants at surprisingly high levels and at levels that have been sufficient to cause reproductive problems in other species of birds. So we don't necessarily know what the levels of those contaminants are that affect loons specifically, but we are finding contaminants at levels that have been shown to affect other birds. So it's possible that chemical contamination is playing a role in reduced loon reproductive success on some lakes. And then the major threat is lead fishing tackle. So in addition to collecting unhatched loon eggs, LPC also collects every dead loon that is reported to us in the state. And we get that loon a necropsy, which is just an autopsy for an animal. We work with the New Hampshire Veterinary Diagnostic Lab at UNH, and we also work with Tufts University Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine, and Dr. Mark Pokris there has been a big force in getting loons necropsied. And what we found is that since 1989, and I will say that this graph only runs through 2019 because we have a bunch of loons from 2020 that still have not been necropsied, so we haven't updated the chart just yet. But between 1989 and 2019, 42% of the adult loons that died in New Hampshire died from lead poisoning that resulted from the ingestion of lead fishing tackle. So that's a huge percentage of our loons that are dying. It's more than any other cause of death. And it's been a problem for loons. So here are some radiographs of some of the loons that we've collected. This bright color is metal density. And so unfortunately, both of these loons did die. We've only ever had one case where a loon was successful treated for lead poisoning, and that's because it was caught really early. The majority, nearly all loons that ingest lead tackle will die from it. And so when we necropsy these loons, we remove that piece of tackle and we test it. We have some test strips that we use to determine if it's lead or not. And in both of these cases, those metal objects were lead. And so all of these loon deaths from lead fishing tackle are a problem. And the reason that they're a problem, in addition to just losing individual loons, is because they have an effect on our loon population. So loons are long-lived birds. We don't exactly know how long they live because we only started banding loons about 30 years ago. But some of those initial banded loons are still around. There's a loon on Lake Umbagog that was originally banded as an adult in 1993. And so she was at least 3 years old at that point, which means, if she comes back this year, she'll be minimum 31 years old. But because on average loons don't successfully produce a chick until they're 6 years old, and because that loon had a chick the year she was banded, we think she's probably 34 or older. So these are really long-lived birds, and that's good because they have a really low reproductive output. So in New Hampshire, the average reproductive rate for a given loon pair is that they will fledge one chick every other year. So, they're reproducing really slowly, but they make up for it by the fact that they live so many years, so that, if a loon lives to be 30, it'll produce somewhere around 12 chicks in its lifetime. And if you cut that lifetime down prematurely because of lead, then you're losing not only that individual loon, but also all of the chicks that it would have produced throughout its lifetime. And so when we ran our numbers through a population model, what we found is that the number of loons that we've lost to lead poisoning has made it so that our population growth rate has slowed. So our population is still growing, but at a slower rate than it would have been had we not lost those loons. Okay, so now we've just heard all of the depressing news and all the threats. So it'll be good to talk about what's being done to address those threats. So the organization I work for is called the Loon Preservation Committee. We're a nonprofit, and we were founded in 1975 in response to really dramatic declines in New Hampshire's breeding loon population. At that point in time, there were fewer than 100 pairs of loons remaining in the state, which is very well below our carrying capacity. And the founding principle was that if human actions had contributed to those declines, and it seemed very likely that they had, then human actions, if they were targeted and thoughtful, could also reverse them. And so LPC has sort of a four-pronged approach to loon restoration in New Hampshire. We do management, we do education and outreach, we do research, and then we do population monitoring. And so I'll go a little bit more in depth into each of those things. So this is a nest raft. You may have seen one of these before. We don't have any on Pawtuckaway right now, but we do have some on other lakes in the Seacoast region. So if you've been to other lakes, you may have seen one of these. This is designed to address a lot of the problems that I talked about earlier. So it's a new floating island. So on areas where the shoreline has been so developed that there's really no good nesting habitat left, this provides an alternate spot for the loons to try out. And loons tend to prefer nesting on islands. So, you know, it sort of gives the raft an edge, and you know, we hope that they'll use it because an island is a preferable spot. It also has an avian predation cover to sort of camouflage the loons from overhead predators and provide a physical barrier. We anchor them out from the shoreline. So that doesn't necessarily mean that that raccoon's not going to come out and, you know, swim out and predate the eggs, but it makes it a little bit less likely. And then finally, these rafts rise and fall with water levels. They float. So, you know, a loon nesting on this raft is never going to have its nest flooded, and it's never going to have its nest stranded. So we put out, LPC and our volunteers put out between 80 and 90 of these rafts every year. Last year we did 85. And we have a lot of them out on lakes that are, you know, very dammed. So for instance, the Connecticut lakes up in Pittsburgh have many, many loon rafts for the pairs up there because those lakes undergo really dramatic water level changes. In areas that are heavily human trafficked, or in areas where the loons have nested in a really obvious spot and are attracting a lot of attention, we'll also put out these signs. And the signs are just, you know, to remind people that they shouldn't be getting so close to that nest. In areas where, despite the sign being there, the loon nest has continued to fail due to human disturbance, we might also put out a rope line. And the rope line is really just to reinforce the message of the sign, provide a physical barrier between that nest and the boaters, and remind people that they really should not be getting closer to that nest or they could cause it to fail. We do education and outreach. So in addition to presentations like the one I'm giving tonight, we also run Swan Lake Loon Cruises in partnership with the Swan Lakes Natural Science Center. So the woman in the blue shirt here is our Swan Lakes biologist, Tiffany Grady, and folks can go out on the boat with them and learn about loons while they're watching the loons. We also do a live loon cam every year. And actually in recent years, we've been doing 2 loon cams back to back. We stream it throughout the whole nesting process so people can watch as the loons select their nest site, build up their nest, lay the eggs, incubate, and hatch. And we get a really great view of the hatch. And so it's a good way to, you know, be able to watch these loons while knowing that, you know, you're not disturbing them in any way. And it's been a really great educational tool for us as well, because we live stream it to YouTube. And so we have a chat feature that allows us to interact with people who are watching and answer their questions. We are doing the loon cams this year. They'll be starting up in May. So if you're interested, look it up around then on our YouTube channel. We've pursued lead tackle legislation and recently started a lead tackle buyback program to try to reduce loon mortalities from lead poisoning. So in 2013, LPC's data and testimony was really vital in closing some loopholes that had existed in previous lead legislation. And so now the law is that you cannot use in fresh water, and you also cannot sell lead sinkers or lead-headed jigs weighing 1 ounce or less in New Hampshire. And the reason for that weight range is because most of the tackle, the overwhelming majority of the tackle that's been found to kill loons weighed between 0.1 and 1 ounce. So now it's illegal to buy that tackle, but people probably still have it in their tackle boxes from before the ban went into effect. And so now our focus has been trying to encourage and incentivize people to make the switch to non-lead, loon-safe tackle. So we've been running this lead tackle buyback program since 2018. This is a partnership between us, Fish and Game, and several tackle retail shops within the state. You can bring 1 ounce or more of a legal size tackle to any of those shops, turn it in, and in return you get a $10 voucher that you can use to buy replacement tackle or other fishing supplies. So if you or anyone you know has lead tackle still in your tackle box, you can go to loonsafe.org to look up our participating retailers. And I believe the closest one to Nottingham is Pawtuckaway Trading Post in Raymond. They are participants. So that would be a great spot. We do loon rescues. So inevitably during the summer and throughout the rest of the year as well, we'll get reports from people who are noticing that a loon is tangled in fishing line, or that a loon is beaching itself or otherwise acting strangely. And so in those cases, we will go out and try to catch that loon. If it's tangled, we'll untangle it. In this photo, our biologists are taking a blood sample. So we test for lead to make sure it's not lead poisoned. In recent years, we've been taking pretty much every loon that we rescue to a vet just for a radiograph to make sure that there's nothing going on internally. But our goal is really to get these birds back on the water as soon as we possibly can. And that's because loons do very poorly in captivity. That's why you'll never see a loon in a zoo, because they can't handle the stress, they die. And they die because they develop a fungal respiratory disease called aspergillosis when they're stressed out. So, you know, the smallest amount of time we can have them in hand, the better. And so if the vet radiograph shows nothing wrong, we get that loon back out onto the water. Unfortunately, there are cases where it turns out the loon has lead poisoning. And in those cases, we have to consult with expert veterinarians like Dr. Pokris down at Tufts to figure out what the next steps are. And sometimes loons require a couple days of rehab and then can get back out. And in other cases, we do have to make the decision to euthanize. But in recent years, we've been getting a lot of loons that we've been able to get back out on the water. And, you know, later that season or in the next year or the year after that, we see that loon coming back and hatching chicks. And so, you know, that rescue not only saved that individual loon, but also allowed us to, you know, continue to grow the population. You can see on this loon here, if you look down at where its legs are, there are bands on it. And so we do band every loon that we rescue and release so that we can track its progress. And then we do a whole bunch of different research projects, which I'll sort of fly through for the sake of time. So banding and tracking loons, this helps us to figure out basic things about loons, like how long they live, how many chicks they produce over the course of their lifetime, and things of that nature. Causes of loon mortality. So again, we continue to get loons necropsied so that we can detect emerging threats to them. In recent years, we've actually started to find loons that have died of avian malaria, which is something that had not been documented in loons previously. And so we're not sure if it's a climate change impact where, you know, as things warm up, these diseases are migrating northward. But now I think we've had 5 or 6 loons since 2015 that have died of avian malaria. Effects of climate change on loon reproduction. This is what my master's thesis is on. Loons are a northern species, and we're currently at the southern edge of their breeding range. And so as things warm up, it might, you know, become more inhospitable for them for their breeding success. Looking at our data that we've been collecting since 1975, it does seem to be that loons fare worse in terms of how many chicks are produced in warmer years and in wetter years, both of which are things that are predicted to happen as time continues to go on. And so now one thing that we're looking at is how we might be able to adapt our management strategies to address those problems. Effects of contaminants on loon reproduction. Again, we'll be doing a whole presentation on that on April 15th. Cyanotoxins. So we work with Jim Haney's lab at UNH. Every time we band loons, we take a blood sample. And so we send some of that blood to Jim and his team so that they can look and see what sort of cyanobacteria and toxins are in the loons on a given lake. We continue to monitor the effects of lead on loon survival and population growth rates. And then we also look at causes of nest failure. And similar to the causes of loon mortality, the reason we're looking at that is so we can detect any emerging threats and try to find solutions to those threats. And then I'm ending with our monitoring, but last is certainly not least, this is sort of the bread and butter of what we do at LPC. So we divide the state into 5 geographic regions. Each of those regions gets a biologist that's responsible for monitoring all of the lakes to detect loon activity. And in addition to that, each of the 3 largest lakes in New Hampshire, so Mbagog, Squam, and Winnipesaukee, get their own biologist as well. Last year, your biologist was Olivia Fortuna, and she's back again this year, so you might see her on Pawtuckaway. And her job is really to count loons. So we go throughout the state, we go to every lake that we know has loons, and also every lake that has habitat suitable for loons, which ends up being about 350 lakes each summer. And we're trying to count how many loons there are, how many of those loons form a pair, how many of those pairs nest, how many of those nests are successful, and how many chicks hatch, how many chicks survive to the end of the year. And then we're also collecting more detailed data on every nest attempt. So, did they build up a bowl, or did they just sort of lay their eggs on a scrape in the sand and call it good enough? How many eggs did they have? If the nest failed, we put on our detective hats and try to figure out why. Looking for clues, trying to figure out, was this predated by a mammal or a bird, or was this nest flooded? Things like that. And the reason that we do all of this is because we want to, A, be able to track how the population is doing, and B, to be able to determine if our management is working. And so this graph shows our loon population in New Hampshire, starting in 1975 when LPC first started doing our work, and running through recent years. So back in 1975, we had, so this graph is showing on the scale of individual loons. So it's more than 100 loons, but if you divide it by 2, you get the number of pairs we had that year. So we had fewer than 100 pairs back in 1975. And now our population has more than tripled. This red line shows the total number of adult loons in the state. This dark blue line shows the number of those loons that formed a pair. And this lighter blue line down here shows the number of loons that were what we call floaters, those adults that just sort of, visited a bunch of different lakes but didn't have a territory or a mate of their own. So if you add these 2 blue lines together, you get the red line. And this floater population, while it hasn't changed too much, it's held steady. This is a really important population of loons because even though they're not forming a pair and they're not nesting, these are the guys that if a member of the pair dies, they fill in and they're able to, keep that breeding pair alive. Oh, okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the loons specifically on Pawtuckaway. So as Rhoda said, you guys have 2 pairs on the lake, one at the north end, one at the south end. Our biologists first detected the pair on the south end in 1993, and they've been there every year since. And then the north end pair showed up a little bit later. We first detected them in the year 2000. And again, they have been present consistently ever since. In some years, you have had some floaters on the lake, but usually those guys don't stick around because they end up finding a territory of their own and moving on. But yeah, in a given year, you might have 1 or 2 floaters on either of the 2 territories. In terms of nesting success, this north end pair has been doing really well. So they've been around since 2000. They've nested in 18 of the years since then, and they've hatched 24 chicks, 19 of which survived to the end of the season. So 19 chicks surviving in 21 summers is a reproductive rate of 0.9 chicks surviving per year, which is almost double the state average. The state average is 0.5 chicks per year, or 1 chick every other year. And so you guys are, the north end pair anyway, is almost double that. They've got almost 1 chick per year, which is really good and better than a lot of the pairs in New Hampshire do. The Southend Pair has done slightly worse. So they've nested in 17 of the years since 1993. They've hatched 18 chicks, 16 of which survived to the end of the season. So that gives them a reproductive rate of 0.59 chicks surviving per year. So it's slightly less than the North Pair, but still above the New Hampshire state average. So overall, Pawtuckaway is doing really well in terms of your loons. I also want to talk about this female because we did band on Pawtuckaway back in 2000. This is the female that was on the North Territory that year. So this was the first year that pair was there. And we went out and caught them and banded them. So her band combination is green stripe over silver on her right leg, which you can see in the photo on the left, and white over blue on her left leg. I'm just going to grab my notes on this. Yeah, so this female was definitely on that territory between 2000 and 2003. In that time, she hatched 4 chicks with her mate, all of which survived to the end of the season. After 2003, we lost track of her, which unfortunately, is not uncommon. These bands are really, really hard to see. And so, if you don't have a photographer out there like John Rockwood to get a picture of the bands, it can be hard to get the band recite. And our biologists try, but, sometimes the loons are just uncooperative and won't lift their legs up. And so we didn't see her or document her presence between the years 2004 and 2012. It's possible that she was still on the territory, and it's pretty likely that she probably was on the lake, but she could have been kicked off by another loon and replaced in those years. What we do know is that she came back in 2013 and became the female of that North pair again, or remained the female if she had been there in those previous years. And she was seen on territory from 2013 to 2017. In that time, she hatched 8 chicks, all of which survived. So we know for sure this female has hatched 12 chicks in her lifetime, and possibly more if she was the one on territory between 2004 and 2012. Unfortunately, we haven't seen her again since 2017, but again, it could be that we just haven't gotten lucky enough to see her legs. So if you know anyone who's a photographer on the lake and has a long lens that can be used to, get pictures of these loons from a distance, please let them know that we're looking for a band recite on this female. And so that's all I've got for you, and I'm glad to answer any questions you have about loons.
Okay, thank you very much. I learned so much about loons. I really enjoyed your talk. We have a question. If a lake becomes too populated or developed for the loons to safely nest, will they move to another lake?
They might, yeah, if there are just no good nest sites, they definitely might do that. Loons are pretty stubborn creatures though, and even if they have a nest site that's failed and failed and failed, sometimes they'll continue to use it and continue to try. So it sort of depends on the individual loon. Sometimes we do have loons that move on and try a different site, and sometimes they'll stay and give it the old college try, even though it's probably not going to work out. So it's about a 50-50 shot.
And what months do they lay their eggs? Someone's asking.
Yeah, so the earliest loons in New Hampshire that, the ones that start nesting earliest, which tend to be in the southern portion of the state where the lakes ice out sooner, will lay their eggs early to mid-May. And then on average, they're laying their eggs the first week of June, but there are some pairs that wait until even, early to mid-July to start their nest. So it's sort of a range, but most loons start laying in early June.
I'm wondering, how there's 2 pairs on Pawtuckaway. Is that like the maximum? And how many loons can the state actually have room for how big, depending on how big their territory is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the number of pairs that a given lake can hold depends on the size of that lake, but also the geography of it. So in addition to, having enough space, the loons also need to have a good nest site in their territory. And if there's not an island or a marshy area, probably that territory won't work. So they need to have a couple things: nest site, enough fish, and other things of that nature. So Pawtuckaway probably is not going to get a third loon pair, based on what the lake looks like. I think 2 is probably the max there, but we do have lakes that, have a bunch of small coves or a bunch of islands, and are big enough to have more pairs. So Lake Winnipesaukee, for instance, in a given year will have between 25 and 30 pairs of loons. And that's why it gets its own biologist. And the same thing with Swan. Swan has right now, I think 14 pairs of loons, but has had up to 16 in the past. And, similar with Umbagog. In terms of how many loons the state can hold, that's a really good question. And we've run population models and we've analyzed, using GIS, analyzed suitable habitat. And we think that the number is somewhere between 1,200 and 1,600 loons.
Interesting. Someone wants to know, do loons ever kill each other?
They do, yeah. So, loons are, within the family unit, loons are great and they take great care of each other, but they are very, very territorial. And so if we call it an intruding loon, it's usually a younger loon that, is maybe trying to figure out if it can kick one of the member of the pair out and take its place. If that intruding loon comes in and, challenges the member of the pair that's the same sex. So both male and female loons will fight. And they can and they will battle to the death. We have loons that, have died because they've been speared by another loon's bill. And when we do the necropsies, we see in their sternum, big holes. And sometimes we see healed over holes as well. So they're tough birds, and sometimes they can survive being pierced even through their sternum. But sometimes they do get unlucky and that other loon's bill hits an organ. And sometimes when we go out to rescue a loon, that's the case, that it's really in trouble because it's gotten into a fight.
Okay, great. Not great that they kill each other, but
it's interesting. It's
good
not
to know
nice
that
to
they
think about,
don't
but
always that they can survive the hole like that. Someone wants to know, do the loons ingest the lead sinkers while eating fish, or do they scoop the sinkers off the substrate?
yeah, that's a good question. And we think there are a couple different ways that they're ingesting the tackle, but we do think primarily it's through eating a fish that has broken an angler's line. And now that fish is trailing the line and it's ingested any tackle that was on that line. Typically when we do the necropsies, in addition to finding the tackle, the tackle's still got the line on it. It's still got all sorts of other attachments like lures or, spinners or things. And so we used to think that they were primarily getting it from scooping it off the bottom. And that's because loons don't have teeth. And so they actually do swallow pebbles that they keep in a muscular portion of their digestive system called the gizzard. And those pebbles act like surrogate teeth. When they swallow a fish, that fish goes down in there, the muscles contract and grind the rocks grind up that fish. And so it's possible that loons are sometimes, picking up a lead sinker from the bottom, thinking it's a rock. That does happen. We think it's we don't necessarily think that it's the leading way that they're ingesting that lead anymore, because loons are smart birds, and most of the ones that we're necropsying have the lead tackle has all this other stuff on it, and we think that they'd be able to tell them apart, and realize that's not a rock. And also the number of lead mortalities, if loons were primarily ingesting lead from the bottom, we think that we'd have a pretty equal amount of loon deaths every month, starting from April and running through November. But what we're actually seeing is that the lead mortalities follow a predictable pattern, and that pattern corresponds with when people are using the lakes more frequently. So loons can ingest it both ways, but we think probably from active use and from ingesting a fish that has the tackle is probably the leading way they're ingesting it.
This one I was kind of wondering about too, because Pawtuckaway is a dammed lake, and now there's some agreement, I guess, that can go down when they need water in Newmarket or someplace. But anyhow, someone wanted to know, does the filling of the lake with the dams affect the loons on Pawtuckaway?
So it doesn't, or it hasn't in the past. The loons have been very successful without a raft. But this is something that we monitor on lakes that we know have dams, and we do have a list of the lakes that have dams. And typically if the loons fail for 3 years in a row from a problem that can be solved by a raft, we'll put a raft out. We haven't had to do that yet on Pawtuckaway because the loons have been very successful. So far it doesn't seem like the changes in water level due to the dam have affected the loons there, but it is something we're keeping an eye on.
And so do they tend to nest at the same site each year?
Yeah, usually they do. If the nest has failed, sometimes they'll move, sometimes they'll stick with it. But they do have high rates of nest site fidelity, particularly when they've been successful at that site.
And this is our last question. Do you know if there are any loons on Stonehouse Pond in Barrington? This person thought they heard one there last fall while they were hiking around the pond.
Yeah, so we don't think that they nest there because it's a smaller pond, but I have seen loons there. I actually had to rescue a lead poison loon there once, and as I was doing that, there was another loon on the pond as well. So they definitely visit there. There might be a pair that's there throughout the season, but they haven't nested as far as we're aware.
Oh, okay, this is the very, very last question. Do they mate for life?
Yeah, so that's something that was really widely believed, and it's sort of true. So because loons have really high territory fidelity, meaning that they're really devoted to that territory, especially if it's a good territory that has allowed them to produce chicks. Typically, loons mate, if not for life, then long term. But if one of that pair dies over the winter, then its mate will pair up with another loon that comes and land. It'll replace it in the pair. And likewise, if an intruding loon comes in and battles the member of that pair and wins, then that the remaining pair member will link up with that new loon and will accept the fact that it has a new mate. And that's because the loons are really much more faithful to the site than they are to each other. So they can always replace a mate, but if they have a really, really good territory that has a great nest site, has a lot of fish, they want to keep that.
That's great. Thank you so, so much, Carolyn. I really appreciate your talk. Lots of thank yous coming in here. And I think I'm sure we all learned a lot from it, and we appreciate you speaking. And we hope that we learned more when we see our loons out there.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And we are always looking for new volunteers. So if anyone is interested in, providing us with updates on what you're seeing on the lake, please do email me. You can reach me at volunteers@loon.org.
Excellent. Okay, and don't forget that our next talk is going to be on Tuesday, April 20th at 7 p.m. about the Revolutionary War generals. So thanks again. Look forward to enjoying another nice loon season, hopefully.
Thanks, Rhoda. Have a great night.
You too. Night. Night, everyone.